Here we go. Welcome everyone. It is almost 7:30 and this is the second start of our town hall tonight. Terry and I are managing the technical aspects on our own for the first time without our beloved John. So we are now live on Facebook and we are about to start our September update for now our monthly live town hall series. And we will be doing this for the next 9 months. This gives us an opportunity to make sure that we have adequate time to book interesting guests and curate data and evidence as it comes forward on a number of topics that are going to be of great interest in the upcoming months, which are obviously the achievements of the biomedical community in reducing mortality, which continues a steady decline, and the anticipated release of vaccines to deal with COVID in the upcoming year. So we'll be presenting some evidence today, and we'll be talking about 5 major topics. So welcoming my co-host and friend, Terry, who will be keeping an eye on the chat window as well as the Facebook Live in order to bring forward any questions that you might have. There is about a 1-minute delay on Facebook Live compared to the Zoom. So if you need to stop me to ask any questions, please be aware of that delay. We will try our best to not go speeding past anything. And as and when you have questions, just go ahead and bring them up. We prefer for this format to be conversational rather than just me talking about various PowerPoint slides. So it's much more interesting if we have a conversation, if you have questions, and Terry can stop me or you can just jump right in. We were previously using a webinar format, which was good for managing questions and answers, but we find it adequate to also use the chat window and the opportunity for you to just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in with questions, or if you'd prefer not to unmute, you can just type them in the chat window. Okay, so with that, I will start up our our deck here. So again, this is our September update. We did 24 continuous weeks of updates on COVID. And during that 6-month series, we have disseminated public health recommendations, evidence on COVID discoveries. We will continue to do that on our resource page that's listed here, fb.com/Sanjay Udoshi. And if you want an invitation to our more detailed group, which consists mostly of those who are working in the biomedical community as either healthcare workers or researchers, or those who are interested in that level of detail, feel free to ask for an invite. Either Terry or I. Terry is an admin on both of these pages, and we will be happy to have you join us and contribute. As always, we try to show the screen at the beginning and the end of our town halls, because one of the other important aspects of the pandemic that we've tried to bring forward is the fact that a lot of people are feeling a lot of stress, anxiety, depression, and to many, some are experiencing despondency. So if you know anyone who is, of course, not themselves or needs someone to talk to, please reach out to them personally. If you feel that they're beyond the general support of their friends, family, and community, please urge them to get in touch with someone who can help them further, especially if they are feeling having any thoughts of self-harm or of course harm towards others. That's very important that we support them through this. And the National Suicide Hotline is right there on that screen. So today we are going to talk about what to expect during the impending second wave of COVID. I believe we have our good friend Mike Kidd joining us from Texas.
We do have people in the waiting room.
Oh, we do. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay. No, I'm just letting you know.
Yeah.
They messaged me and I'm bugging you.
Okay, where's my waiting room? Participants, admit all. Here we go. Okay, so Mike has joined us. Outstanding. So it's great to see Mike joining us. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today has come from him, his contributions on and analyzing the COVID data, putting it in a concise format for all of us to understand has been invaluable. And whenever I see his analysis on his page, I share it to our COVID resource page. It helps us really understand what the data is, what the data means, because a lot of times interpretation and analysis is as important as or in fact, many times more important than the raw data. So I will ask him to jump in, whether he likes to or not, and try to help us understand his analysis of the second wave that is, due or we already see certain indicators showing that it is indeed impending. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to the second wave, what to expect, and what are the potential impacts of it on our daily lives, especially in comparison to what we went through in the very early stages of the first wave in March and April. Perhaps we can get his opinion on how it may differ and how it may be similar to what we've already experienced. So Terry and I began talking about this, and it became very clear that these pandemic threats have been coming from a source. And to try and be politically correct and avoid naming that source or trying to somehow mitigate the fact that a lot of these pandemics that have long-lasting impact, but also a severe short-term impact on the global welfare of people throughout the world, as well as our individual national economies and the global economy as a whole. It is perhaps time for us to address the conditions in which these originate and the fact that the regulations in China and in other Asian countries are not as needed in order to preclude the origination of novel pandemic infectious agents, and what the European Union and the United States should do about China, other Asian nations that generally and quite blatantly circumvent international norms on biohazard containment, biohazard risk. Obviously, there are other news stories coming out of China that are not as well known, but the most recent of which was in, I think, late July or August, a cloud of aerosolized particles carrying Brucella migrated from one location to a veterinary processing arena in China, infecting a number of animals, which then infected human beings. So these are weird events, and they come from a lack of attention paid to biohazard risk. So we can talk about what you guys think should be done, and Terry and I have opinions on it, but it really comes down to the same kind of risk that we faced from Middle Eastern actors and others who wanted to stockpile biological or chemical weapons. We must regard these threats of pandemic as a kind of maybe not overt bioterrorism, but a opportunity for us to suffer in very much the same ways as a bioterror attack, and therefore it should be dealt with by the international community as such. And I'd love to hear your opinion on that. I know Terry has strong ones. So
I promised no nuclear solutions.
okay.
We've taken that off the table.
Okay, good.
So something else.
Good. So then also we want to talk about long COVID. Unfortunately, I have been following a neighbor, a friend of our community here of people who join us from northeastern Pennsylvania on these town halls. A lovely person that is suffering for a extended period of time with COVID, has tested positive serially 5 times over the last 3 months, and has ended up in hospital over the weekend with a number of failures in quality and safety of her care. So what I will be covering is a little bit of the long haul syndrome, both in the mild form and the most severe forms, what to look out for, and then the critical biomarkers that clearly are being missed by the majority of clinicians in terms of addressing both acute and post-acute COVID. And what are these biomarkers being? Why are they not uniformly being ordered and assessed as part of the diagnostic workup of these patients? I have strong opinions on that. I've made them clear for weeks and months now that the lack of national protocols and guidance issued by, bodies such as the CDC, NIH, and others who are responsible for creating these safety nets of evidence-based guidance in times of crisis, in times of pandemic and epidemic, in times where novel science is being developed on a week-to-week basis and needs dissemination to workers who are struggling, spending 99% of their time addressing patient care and do not have the bandwidth to absorb guidelines, that are being not regularly pushed out, not effectively pushed out, not disseminated in a way that is part of their work stream and helps them all practice a standard of care in addressing the pandemic. These are massive failures, and it's causing not only death undue, but it is definitely also causing very poor quality of care and very poor patient safety issues. And that's, if I'm sitting here in a small corner of the world in northeastern Pennsylvania, and dozens of stories are getting fed to me on a weekly basis of failures in patient care, what is the real size of the problem out there? I mean, that is very distressing. So we'll talk about biomarkers, prognosis in these 2 states of COVID. And then people have asked me to arm them with information in case they end up in an ER, and in case they are in a community hospital where that healthcare team is not completely up to date on, evidence-based, up to the latest way to deal with COVID patients as recommended by Mayo Clinic, Brigham and Women's, Johns Hopkins, of course, and others that are, and Mount Sinai, and the list is long of our top 20 to 25 academic and university medical centers in the country that have done their utmost to create up-to-date recommendations on treatment protocols, diagnostic protocols, workups, to try and make sure that everybody that has COVID and ends up in an ER with either moderate to severe COVID does not progress to the state in which they need ICU care, ventilation. We know that state of patient care leads to high mortality and very, very high morbidity. So this is very important, to be armed with the right information, even if you have to hand it to the doctors and nurses when you get to the ER. I need you to pay attention to this. If you don't know that this is a standard of care, read it and go to this website, because actually that will help you. And it helps you help them help you. Okay. All right. So I usually pause here to ask for any questions, because I can only see this screen. I can't really see all of the other windows in the, for example, chat and Facebook Live. So are there any questions? Is there anyone else that I need to admit?
I do have a question on Facebook.
Yes.
Okay, this is from Lori Larson Dornbos. And she asked, how effective do you feel a home air purifier would be in light of the latest droplets versus aerosol issue on the CDC website? I guess the one they took back down.
Yeah, I would say that a home-based air purification is not something you should be very concerned about. You would need, high efficiency particulate filter similar to the ones used in clinical environments in hospitals and ICUs, especially ICUs, to really have any effectiveness. If you have to understand that the COVID isn't trying to creep into your house from just outside. It needs to be carried by a human being. So unless you have a very high traffic home with a lot of people that come in and out of it that you don't know, and they have a large community bubble, and a community bubble is the number of contacts a person has on a daily basis. If you have a small community or family bubble of just what we generally call a nuclear extended family of yourself, your children, and maybe grandparents and others that may be living with you, the best way to keep yourself safe is not with an air purifier necessarily, but mask usage when you're outside of the home will do not the entire job of protection, but will do a majority of what's necessary to keep you from inhaling large droplets that could be contaminated by COVID in public environments like grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations, where there's a lot of human traffic. Maybe if she wants to clarify her question, but this is my answer to that, which is, unless you live in a very high traffic home or an apartment complex, or something where you want an additional level of protection, the air filtration is not going to guarantee that every square foot of air, every square meter of air is going to be effectively filtered at every time duration, let's say, hour or 6 hours. That's highly variable. So what I'm trying to say is, you can't assume that buying a high efficiency filter, running it 24 hours a day, making sure that you're cleaning, replacing the filters, is going to provide any protection that is guaranteed. Or what is guaranteed protection, or somewhat, I should say, more effective protection, is the general knowing who's coming in and out of your house. If they're outside of the house in high human traffic areas, getting tested regularly is very much more effective than buying an expensive piece of equipment. Wearing a mask always when you are within 6 feet of people that you don't know, and especially in public. These are much more effective than buying a filter. So that's my answer on that. Okay. All right. I still have people coming in, so I'm going to admit them. I wish we could just admit them automatically, but.
Yeah, I put the Zoom link up in Facebook, so
okay.
The few will come over from there.
All right. So what we have going on here is an impending second wave. So we knew this was coming. Because most epidemic or pandemic events have a second wave that is significantly greater than the first one. This is for many reasons, and really it comes down to behavior. A lot of these societies that went through them, you know, over 100 years ago, and then more recently in the last 15 to 25 years in Asia, with the SARS and H1N1. There is a certain complacency that occurs when case counts get back to somewhat of a baseline, and they remain low for a period of time. That complacency leads to, you know, a need for normalcy, to regain a sense of normalcy within the society, going back to your normal routines, reopening businesses, reopening your schools and other, you know, venues for human interaction. That done too soon leads to what we saw here in the United States in June through mid-August, which is a massive and rapid rise, which was really not a second wave, but actually a outbreak on top of the first wave. So that's very clearly indicated here because, sorry. So that's very clearly indicated here because, you know, we had this rapid increase in March and April. Not a very good response in the United States in terms of the flattening of the curve or the mitigation. And then we hit June, and for whatever reason, while the rest of the world paid attention to the lockdown and took the potential, you know, consequences of not locking down quite seriously throughout Asia and Europe, there was no such seriousness here in the United States. And that's why we saw the curve kind of just flatten here instead of down here, which is the appropriate flattening, which you see here in orange, which is Europe. This is the actual flattening of the curve. People say that this part of the curve is what flattens over time if implementation of non-pharmaceutical intervention is achieved. It's actually more of this. You eventually want the tail end of the infection wave to stay flat, okay, until you can have things other than non-pharmaceutical intervention, such as vaccination and therapeutics, take a greater effect. So ideally, Europe would have stayed like this, or you know, ideally, whatever they were able to achieve in June through August and into September. Ideally, this achievement should have stayed here. Okay. Unfortunately, as you can see in this curve, it is bending back upwards, and it's bending back upwards to a point where it's at a height greater than the initial first wave. So Mike's analysis, which actually I prefer if he take us through it, if he can, we can unmute him. Hey, Mike.
Hey, how you doing?
Man, it is so great to meet you.
Good to be here.
Great. So yes, so I've been praising you for months now. Your analysis has been essential to me and my understanding of the data that's being gathered, as well as the data that's not being gathered, which is also incredibly useful to understand why there are huge gaps in our understanding. So if you want to, I'll hand over the baton to you in terms of what your thoughts are on this, what this curve in orange indicates, what it might mean to the United States. And you can see a corresponding loss of control over the last 7 days here with things ticking upwards. I have a slide which, you know, this is an indication of since we've gotten back to school and colleges especially, there has been outbreak. You know, these are miniature outbreaks at the campus level, but they are coalescing into something very significant. We're seeing more than 88,000 cases as a result of kids going back to school, to college alone. We don't really know what what our public schools are doing, because we don't have, again, we have a gap in data. We have a inadequate assessment of what's going on there. So inadequate that we have individuals trying to create spreadsheets and put them on Google spreadsheets so that the rest of us can see what the hell's going on. But Mike, I'm going to shut up now, and you are going to tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with Europe. What they're experiencing right now is kind of what we've been through with the overall orange curve being a little bit misleading. It's really a sum of several very different lines. So kind of like we had New York, New Jersey, the Northeast got really slammed in the first wave, and everywhere else was pretty much untouched. And then the South took over, and now we're seeing the Midwest rise. So the one combined line is really just adding several different curves that are experiencing very different things. So what we're seeing in Europe overall is that they were at very good low levels, through June at least, maybe a little bit into July, but then things started rising a little bit. And it's mostly driven by Spain and France at this point. If you broke out the populations, you would see Spain is actually doing, in terms of case counts per capita, way worse than the US right now, and France is catching up very quickly. Whereas a lot of other countries like Germany are still doing pretty well, and some of the Nordic countries very, very low, UK not too bad. But in general, what you're seeing is that back around the start of July, they relaxed perhaps a little bit too much. And on a linear graph like this, right, where you've got at the bottom of that curve, where it first starts coming up around day 140 or so, on a linear chart, it's really hard to notice when it first starts creeping up. Creeping up 20, 30% a week still looks almost like a flat line when you're at the bottom. So that's one where a log chart would actually show you a little quicker when the inflection point actually hit. But what that shows is a few countries that have had just a little bit too loose, and things have been slowly compounding. It's not like the ultra steep first rise where like New York was seeing case counts double every 3 days. This is more like, a doubling over a period of several weeks. If you look at Spain or France alone, their graph looks steeper because it's obviously, they're driving pretty much the whole increase in the curve. So I don't know enough about the details of what they loosened. I mean, certainly France did a huge amount of loosening around the June, July timeframe. And you got the European vacation phenomenon that's much more pronounced than it is in the US.
Right.
So so my guess is they've, you've got, Spain and France now are doing a lot of partial lockdowns, postal code driven, certain cities, certain regions having different levels of lockdowns happening. But keep in mind that always takes 2 or 3 weeks before you see it showing up on the graph in terms of a weekly average of case counts. So hopefully if they did the right things 3 weeks ago, we'll see it level off real quickly. My sense is they're still not taking it quite seriously enough because the death toll is still not rising very much. But I'll get into that when I talk about the US, because we saw the same thing if you look at Florida and Texas. So looking at the US, that second big hump was mostly the southern US. And then as it started coming down, some of those recovery was offset by rises spreading through the upper Midwest, in particular the Dakotas, and now Wisconsin joining them. And in this last week, it shows a sharp bump up. And that is a bump that if you look at the 4 regions of the US, they're mostly all showing a similar bump at exactly the same time, which is, for a data analyst, that says something weird is happening here, because usually those curves are experiencing different weather and different situations politically and with the health management. So I'm a little bit suspicious of whether what we're seeing is a crash in late August and a spike in September, or if we're just seeing a mirage dip in the data and it's really been more or less flatline over the last 4 or 5 weeks. Really hard to tell. It is likely that the climb we're seeing is not from colleges or schools opening yet. That would be just a little bit too quick. They might be a tiny contributor, but the impact of that we're going to see towards the end of September into October, as we've had time for a couple generations of transmission, and then those people getting more severe symptoms and then getting tested, the tests getting reported, and then that finally rolling into a weekly average. So I'm I would be pretty confident in saying that the downtrend we had through the late summer has probably stopped. I'm not convinced yet that we're actually on an uptrend, but we've got two big things happening that would suggest it's at least likely. One is, the back to school in person, grade school, high school, universities. That's a lot of people having a lot of contacts in a not entirely distanced manner, mostly indoors, and that's, all else being equal, that's going to cause more cases. And the second one is we're starting to get more fall weather, where not only where it gets colder and people go inside, but the humidity in the air decreases, so people are breathing in drier air, which seems to obviously help respiratory diseases get a foothold. So we could be seeing that, but that would lead me to expect the Northeast and the Midwest seeing a big rise when maybe the West and the South wouldn't, or they would see it 6 weeks later. And we're not seeing that yet. So it's a little bit too early to tell. And I guess if we got time, the one other thing I'd like to hit is the big delay we were seeing in our second wave of cases going up for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, cases tripling, and still no change at all in the death rate. And then finally it started rising. And in case after case, what seems to be happening is that, well, first of all, overall, our death rate is lower. I mean, if you get COVID today versus getting it in March, you're in a much better situation, and there's a lot of likely reasons for that. But the delay is largely driven because as you reopen and the numbers of cases start going up, it's generally the teens and 20s that are showing the sharpest percentage increase. They tend to have asymptomatic or very mild disease courses, but they spread it to family members. And then what you see is 2 or 3 weeks later, the numbers start rising among the older cohorts. And then you start seeing the hospitalizations and the deaths following that. So we saw that in Florida, we saw it in Texas, we saw it in Arizona. It was young people first, then middle age and older, then the hospitalizations, then the deaths. And they're just now starting to see the death counts coming up in Spain, just hinting up in France. And I suspect over the next 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to see those numbers rise rather sharply.
So this is clearly a indication for what we might expect, what we likely are to expect, I should say, because as you just indicated, so with the younger generation being the larger portion of infected in this latter part of the pandemic now in the last 2 to 3 months, the death rate following the infection rate, as you mentioned, was about 2 to 3 weeks earlier. Now it's about 4 to 6 weeks following any uptick in the infection rate. So that's something that you brought forward that was very eye-opening for me. That, in fact, and Terry and I were discussing this before we started tonight. It is way too early to know whether reopening the schools has had any effect at all, because we will, as you just mentioned, have to wait at least 4, 5, 6 weeks into the fall. That means early November, correct? Before we really understand the impact of opening these schools. We're already seeing the infections throughout the colleges that have reopened, and the kind of irresponsible behavior that we knew college students were going to display being part of the reason it's spreading. So that's one thing. Thank you for bringing that forward. The one thing that I want to go back to the beginning of when you started talking about Spain and France and others in Europe, I'm also getting information from one of the friends of our page, Dr. Daniela Marasco, that in Italy, after almost 5 months of continuous good performance, the cooler air, the changes in behavior in terms of where people gather and how they're gathering, and not necessarily a decline in vigilance of mask usage or other forms of NPI, has led to a small uptick, and that may be the indicator of Italy's fall wave. Whether that is a aggressive second wave or not, she's not sure, but it definitely is in parallel to what is being seen in France and Spain. Additionally, that brings me to the point that you made about 4 different regions of the United States are all seeing an uptick at the same time, which generally is an indicator of something. We don't know what that something is yet, but it is something that we have to pay attention to. Now,
Hey, real quick, check the waiting list.
yes. Oh my God, we've got another one of our luminaries. Doug has joined us. Doug, welcome to the town hall. Great to have you with us. We have had Mike here talking with us. I didn't see you in the waiting room, so sorry for the delay in bringing you in. We've been talking about his observations on the data as we are getting into the fall here and the impending second wave, what the data may be indicating. Okay, so back to the point I was trying to make here. And Mike, I'm going to bring up the other slide that you actually posted, which is how serious do we need to get about this? I will hand it over to you again in a moment, but the eye-opener here is that these numbers, right? So an additional 1.2 million people could be affected, could die if we go forward without a strategy. If we go forward with a mitigation strategy, an additional 750,000 almost people could die before March 1st. And the reason March 1st is indicated here is that that's the earliest possible reasonable availability date for vaccines. And even then, that's a very aggressive schedule. And then, Mike, I want you to talk to us about suppression, because when you said that in Spain and France, there are certain towns that are undergoing more, aggressive lockdown. And I think it's because they have more granular, at least they have a more targeted approach based on more granular data. It doesn't seem that we have that kind of granular data or targeted approach whatsoever here in the United States. So, micro-targeting by postal code and things like that with mitigation or suppression efforts, as they did aggressively in South Korea, which was so successful, as well as in Tokyo and in Hong Kong. Anyway, go ahead. I'll let you go.
Yeah. So I think, and a large part of that is because we're still having the political debate about whether we should be doing anything or how much. And while that debate's going on, trying to do things like having the state actually manage it at a county level, with each county changing codes every week and that automatically triggering certain restrictions. I mean, that's just something you can't do until you agree that you want what your strategy is. That's how you get the strategy.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to show with these 3 graphs is, the very high wildfire one. That's just, we completely ignore it. Everyone goes back to doing everything like they always were. And we just say, hey, it's, people are going to die. We're just going to let it happen and get it over with. No country is advocating that. No one, that's not the Sweden approach. They're doing something very, very different. But that's just, for the people who are wondering, should we just give up entirely and move on with our lives? The answer is still a no. Even if the fatality rate is now down to maybe 0.4 or 0.5%, it's still very, very contagious. There's still a lot of people that would die if we did that. And that's discounting the fact that it would absolutely overrun our health system and that would collapse. So the real 2 possible strategies are, 1, try to drive it to a pretty low level and keep it there. That's what I call a suppression strategy. And it's worth talking about, has it gotten to the point where the fatality rate is low enough and the side effects are, long-term effects are maybe tolerable, that maybe with the cost of keeping it low, we'd be better off just saying, let's keep the hospitals running, but let's try to get to herd immunity as quickly as we can. And what happens when if you make reasonable assumptions on when a vaccine might be out and how many people we could have dying, if we just let the death rate go up to about 5,000 a day from our current sub 1,000, we would still be running into March, April, May with 5,000 deaths a day. and still not be deep into the herd immunity zone. So that's still a really unattractive prospect. But the key thing that I realized last week, and I'd sort of been aware of it, but never really thought of it so clearly, is that once you're at the level of the gray line or the level of the yellow line on the bottom, it takes the same effort to hold that line level. If you're going to do a given amount of effort, you might as well do it with 20 times fewer deaths. And in fact, at the lowest level of suppression, at that level, contact tracing can actually carry a significant chunk of the work, and you can actually open up more than you could if you were following the gray line and taking heavier tolls. So it takes some effort up front to get down to that level, but we've seen Europe do it. We've seen Australia do it twice. Israel may try to do it a third time now, so that it can be done, but we just haven't really decided what is our strategy. Is it try to just barely keep the hospitals from overflowing, or is it keep it down to 100 deaths a day and see if we can hold that level?
Yeah, so one of your phrases that I've repeated many times over the last few months is running your healthcare system at red line is not optimal. Terry has heard me say that almost every week. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's inhuman for the healthcare providers. It's inhuman in terms of the toll it takes on people. This is still way worse than a bad flu in terms of contagion and the danger per person infected. So that it's just not something that we can just say, as long as the hospitals aren't overflowing, we're fine. It's a bad situation.
Yeah, and the seriousness with my concern now, and this comes to a lot having to do with the topic of desensitization of what has happened to us and continues to happen to us as a result of this pandemic. So I am continually surprised by reading Canadian threads or threads from other countries wherein an outbreak of 125 cases in a day is a cause for massive alarm. Okay, massive alarm. Like people are just and then 22, 27 deaths are just in a day.
Yeah, in fact, I was just looking at Australia's current situation where they had the big outbreak in Victoria and went to a special code 4 super lockdown. And I was looking at the steepness of their curves and I was thinking, wow, that was big and they got a handle on it quickly. And then just for grins, I put the US one per capita over it. And there's just flattened into a little tiny speed bump at the bottom.
Exactly. So we have become desensitized to this level of catastrophe. It is a human catastrophe. That's the problem with trying to convince people that suppression is now valid, because they've gotten used to even the failure of mitigation. They have gotten used to seeing these atrocious numbers. And I don't think many of them truly fathom the depths of what it means to lose 1,200 people in a day to one disease. And as you said, there's a political environment that is also causing a lot of dehumanization of the realities. So I've heard over and over people talk about, we're doing fine compared to, or we're doing better than this state, or it's all a mess compared to some of the other parts of the world, especially the one that you brought up where suppression has worked. And because of the people in that society becoming used to suppression as their strategy, these speed bumps that you mentioned of 125 cases their reaction to it is far more aggressive and far more significant towards the end goal, right? Our reactions to this level of persistent, healthcare utilization, percent positivity, or number of cases coming forward on a daily and weekly basis in our country, I believe has led to desensitization. And I don't know how to convince anyone why it would be necessary, why it should be necessary, or why it is important for us to look at what we have done again. Because I'll let you talk about it a little bit. Do you know where I'm going with this? Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that politics is a difficult part of it, not just in the U.S. You know, I've been following threads on the U.K. and Spain and France, where they're having their debates on, okay, things are going up. Is this worth dealing with? How much do we have to deal with? And one very understandable argument is, sure, cases have tripled, but deaths haven't changed. It's been 4 weeks. Clearly, it's not as dangerous as it used to be. And trying to go through the abstractions of, you know, what is your age mix of recent cases versus the first wave? How is that changing? What can we expect to see with the death toll coming up? And the time delays involved from, you know, a policy decision to contagion to symptoms to testing to hospitalization. You know, it's just such a huge lead time that it's until you're halfway up the curve or more, it's a very rational case to say deaths are still flat. There's no need to hurt the economy.
Right.
And by the time you see the death rate starting to come up because your older people started getting infected a month ago, by then you're going to be 3 weeks in the hole, even if you reacted today. So it's a tough one to crack, and it's one that takes a huge amount of discipline for a political leadership to say, all right, we're seeing cases up, deaths are flat, but we're still going to pay the price of slowing something down to get the rate back under control early.
We were going to ask you for your for a more detailed analysis, not right at this second, but we were going to ask you, Terry's interest has been on, and my interest as well, has been on the cost to the healthcare system, not from acute COVID, but from post-COVID. So what that means is our analysis has shown, even from April and May, I would say, when we first began to really get a grip around who gets affected, how badly, and things like that. Overall, we still continue to say that about 80% of people who get infection will recover with a very mild case. About 12% will have a moderate course of the disease, which they may describe as the worst flu they've ever had. About 6.5% will have a very severe case, and that severity is very varied. Obviously, it could affect them in a way that causes ARDS, acute respiratory distress, or it could cause them 12 to 18 days of intractable fever, breathlessness. It could result in cardiac damage, liver damage, kidneys, etc. So we've covered this, but about 6.5% end up with remarkable morbidity as a result. And then you have the remaining 2.5% that has now been whittled down to, in our statistics, probably about 0.6 to 0.8 hospital mortality. That's different from the case or infection mortality, death rate. But hospital mortality is down from about 2.5%. Whoever of the people who were admitted to the hospital with COVID, in the beginning, about 2.5% died. Now that's down to between 0.6 and 0.8, depending on what part of the country you're talking about. And that's a very significant achievement. We applauded the healthcare community for doing that over the last 6 months, achieving a decline in mortality that's significant over the course of 6 months. Our concern now is for those who have recovered from COVID, like our friend Katie, who are suffering with long COVID, and their increased or continuous utilization of healthcare, the system, right? The healthcare system. They need repeated blood work, repeated imaging, repeated hospitalization, perhaps repeated visits to their doctors to complain about poor health, and trials of different medications that may alleviate some symptom but may not help them overall. The cost of that is probably in my estimation, over 10 years, about 1.4 trillion. Just now, right now, because we're estimating about 740,000 long COVID sufferers from this initial 6 months of infections. But in your curve, let's go bring this back up. Where am I? How do I share? I am non-expert at Zoom, even after many months. Okay, so talk about what it 10 to 12% population who 10 to 12% of the people who get infected over the next 6 months. What does that look like if 10 to 12% recover with morbidity?
I can give you some broad numbers. I mean, if you take 330 million total, if you assume that about 40 million have already been infected, that's confirmed cases plus a much larger number just based on our serology tests and some decent estimates. Should be in about that ballpark. And then you, of course, need to guess as to what the herd immunity end game rate would be. Let's say it's 60%, so you need to get somewhere approaching 200 million people immune. That's another 160 million infections. You take 10% of that, that's 16 million people. That adds up in a heck of a hurry, and running that level of deaths and that level of infection hospitalization for the next 6 months is that has huge add-on impacts to the economy and people's psychology and everything else that could possibly go with it for consumer spending or any other measure you want to look at. So there's I don't want to paint mitigation as always a bad idea. It just depends on where we need to get for herd immunity, how long it's likely to be for a vaccine. If we thought it was 2 years off, that might change the metrics significantly. But even so, there's still a huge benefit to delaying infections as late as you can as we get better and better at treating them and find more tricks and refine our tools to be more effective. So every infection that didn't happen in March and does happen now, we're saving a fraction of a life on every one of those.
Absolutely correct. Yes, exactly. And so this brings me to the ultimate question: if we can't appeal to people's sense of humanity, that thousands of Americans are going to die, and we need to accept that some form of our I really don't even like to call it this, but our personal freedoms are being impinged, if not infringed, in terms of our inability to move about freely, travel freely, mingle freely, do all that other stuff. Those are definitely a pain in the ass, for lack of a clinical term. And so we have not adequately appealed to at least, I would say, 60 million people in this country to take appropriate caution and be effectively part of the response to this pandemic, and they don't feel invested in the humanity of it, the loss of life. They don't feel invested in the not just the death count doesn't matter to them. It just doesn't seem like it has fazed anyone. But will the financial impact? How do we stress to them that it's coming for your wallet at this point?
I think part of it is the people who would like to see a suppression strategy as our best way to surviving until a vaccine is available are sort of losing the framing war on that versus is the cure worse than the disease? Because what they're implicitly comparing is all the costs and downside of lockdowns and distancing and restrictions and closures and bankruptcies and running up the deficit, whatever, against an ideal world where there is no disease and everything is normal. If you look at it that way, suppressing it is very, very expensive. And that's sort of the implicit if we just stopped all this stuff trying to fight it, then we'd be good and we'd be all be rich again. And that's not what the the second choice is. The second choice is either ease up a little bit and watch the rates rise, or give up entirely and watch it all explode. And you look at either of those two, easing up a little bit, you'll save something for the first month, and then you'll be right back in the same lockdown requirements you were facing before, just with a higher level of deaths.
Yeah.
And if you let it go completely, then, when you get a curve like the wildfire one, that's when you have actual breakdown of supply chains and food delivery and just all kinds of stuff breaking.
Right. And this is where we stand right now. I mean, we have a chart that we'll be using, a flow thing that we'll be using every month now at the end of these town halls on a monthly basis, which is our strategy, our 5-step strategy to end the pandemic. And we, I think in the 8th week, so 2 months in, it would have been April, May. By the end of May, we were talking about it, okay? And when it came to testing, and when it came to healthcare, and when it came to, the things that needed to be done to bring the pandemic to an end, we've done none of those effectively in this country. And one of the things that we want to contrast now is, here's where we are, almost 7 million infections. This is today. Almost 200,000, according to the CDC tally, but this 200,000 was exceeded a few days ago, according to Johns Hopkins. A majority of the country in the South and the Midwest, where politically, it seems they don't trust the recommendations that are coming out of the best science, evidence-based recommendations are not being adhered to in these areas. But even in the areas where there is good adherence, we are under very high risk of an impending second wave that Mike just described. And that comes with the cost of life, that comes with the cost of lost productivity, and the economy being partially shut down anyway, because people are afraid to go out and do things that they would normally do. And now we have Thanksgiving and Christmas coming. And good luck shopping, in this environment, and good luck enjoying, the usual Christmas and holiday season with the kind of cloud of fear we have still over us. And this is what Mike was talking about, which is, if we had paid attention and suppressed this effectively, if we had taken advantage of that first 6 to 8 weeks where we shut the country down, and we had effectively brought it down to manageable numbers, where I had set a target of less than 100 cases per state per day. So that's 5,000 cases a day, and that was what could have been a target baseline for us right after we came out of that 6 to 8 weeks. We didn't come anywhere near that, okay? And then we rebounded from a height of, I think we were at around 20 to 25,000 cases a day, to well past 40, and to almost, we had a few days where we were above 65,000 cases a day before it began to decline again. And that's all on that curve that Mike just described. So, my next question here obviously has to do with the dissemination of public health evidence-based recommendations and information. If people aren't going to pay attention and they're not going to follow these recommendations, what are the alternatives for us? Are we going to have to do targeted lockdowns? Because clearly there is absolutely no will for us to lock down an entire state, or even an entire county, if the county is as big as they are in Texas and other places. What is it going to take to deal with this in the next 6 months? And I'm going to pause here to see if there are any questions or comments on what we have been talking about so far.
Yeah, we have several. First, let me go to the Zoom chat, and a question from Daniel Brenton. His wife was told during her last appointment with her primary physician that she should be watching out for a COVID-19 vaccine in October. This was the phone appointment. I don't feel I should interrupt, but I was surprised by the statement. The physician didn't elaborate, but I know the CDC guidance to the states. Maybe this was all he was speaking to. Are you aware of anything going on?
No, and in fact, that may be the product of certain misinformation, politically motivated misinformation. In fact, there is absolutely no indication of availability, either specific or general availability of a vaccine anytime in the next 3 months. So the announcement of vaccines that may have finally cleared a phase of clinical trial known as phase 3 or phase 4, and then are becoming market available, we should be able to hear, we can hear about that, expect to hear about that within the next 3 months, I would say. But general availability to the general public of a vaccine, and any reliance on a vaccine to return to a sense of normalcy in the next 3 months is completely unreasonable. It may be available by as early as March, as Mike has indicated, as an aggressive target for the country to try and get vaccines out to the general public. And even then, those vaccines will be targeting high risk groups. They will also be first given to healthcare community, first responders, and things like that. People who deal with a lot of people, and people who may be the most, based on safety and efficacy testing first, maybe the most at risk will be the ones to receive the vaccines first. So I don't know why that physician would say that, and that is a highly misinformed opinion.
Then I got one from Don Peabody.
Yeah.
And I got to get to the question because he's sporting a really nice beret tonight.
Yeah, I know. It looks great.
Yeah. Percentage immunity and therefore herd immunity. Do we now know that the infection does confirm long-term stable immunity, or is that not what Mike was implying if 200 million were infected?
Mike, you can go ahead, and then I'll
and I'll give my understanding, and feel free to correct or fine tune as needed with like actual medical understanding. But under the assumption that immunity is reasonably stable for like a year or more, and if the R0 estimates of about 2.5 are roughly there, and if there isn't a huge difference in susceptibility that could change some of the numbers, it would be a reasonable guess to say 50, 60, 70% is roughly where we need to be to have effective herd immunity. Now, early on, there was a lot of concern that when they measured antibody levels in the blood of people weeks and months after coming out of an infection, that they were dropping fairly quickly. The reports I've heard in the last couple months suggest that they seem to decline for a couple months and then kind of stabilize. Plus, there's a lot of other parts of the immune system beyond just antibodies in the blood that if you were reinfected, you'd be able to ramp up and shut it down pretty quickly. So I think the recent stuff has been encouraging for both immunity after surviving the disease, as well as potential effectiveness of vaccines and being able to last for a year or 5 years or something in between. It looks reasonably encouraging now, but there's still a heck of a lot we don't know. So any numbers about herd immunity, take them with a big grain of salt right now, because they're just ballpark estimates at best.
Okay, correct. Absolutely correct. And I'll add this. I will add that herd immunity as a strategy to address pandemic or an epidemic, which is indicated by Mike's graph showing, either somewhere between wildfire and mitigation. Just let it go through a population, and they will gain immunity as they recover. Okay, so that as a strategy is a fallacy, and it's a fallacy for many reasons on many levels. We already talked about the fallacy of it providing a rapid return to functional norms for society. So that and also the economic impact and also the other stuff. But clinically and epidemiologically, let's speak about it. So clinically and epidemiologically, one of the reasons we don't have herd immunity for influenza, even though we have a somewhat debatably effective vaccine strategy for influenza, and that is updated on a yearly basis to keep the vaccine that is available every fall up to date in terms of what are the prevalent strains and its safety profile, as well as the effectiveness of it against so protecting against that flu season. So one of the reasons we haven't, as a population or globally, achieved it is the nuances that Mike mentioned. Seroprevalence, or just the presence of antibodies, is not the only indicator of immunity. You may have antibodies against the flu from last year, but they may not be effective neutralizing antibodies. They may just be antibodies that signal to other parts of the immune system that they have come in contact with the influenza virus, and that a secondary layer of immune response is then necessary, such as T-cell response, or such as cell signaling, cytokine response, et cetera. All of the intricacy and nuance of the immune system that's brought to play in fighting a virus, we've talked about the involvement of interferon. We've talked about and how it is a antiviral stimulant. So it's not just one test that can tell you whether you have immunity to an infectious agent. We use the seroprevalence number as a proxy to determine how many people have actually been exposed and now have circulating antibodies, as an indication of their exposure and recovery. That means their immune system detected it. They were infected, their immune system detected it, and there is a indication of that detection and response in the form of antibodies in their bloodstream. Is that a reliable indicator of herd immunity? No. Seroprevalence of about 10 to 12%, which is what we see right now in the New York City area, or in other areas where we've declared hotspots, where infectivity rates were in the 20 to 25% percent positivity rates were up there. They only achieved about 10 to 12% after that wave. There wasn't penetrance of the virus into the population to such a significant level that it resulted in either individual lasting immunity, which serology can only give you an indication of and not complete evidence, one. And then the second part is that even if 30-40% of that populace, New York City or New Orleans or Chicago, 30 to 40% got infected over the course of a 6-month period, we're only seeing 8, 10, 12% seroprevalence. What does that mean? We don't know. Okay. So that's why herd immunity is a fallacy. Someone stopping me?
Oh, I'm just putting up my finger. Back in April, we talked about 8 different strains.
Yes.
That they were watching.
Yes.
And if you get strain A, and this came up in our discussion about convalescent plasma.
Correct.
If you got convalescent plasma from someone who had strain C, what good does that do you if you have strain A?
Correct.
It does nothing. So if you have some immunity from strain A, and this second wave brings in strains E and F, where do you stand on having immunity towards those?
Yeah, the complexity is you're right, and the complexity, the deeper you go, the more complex it gets. Terry just mentioned the 8 strains that we're tracking. Now, within the prevalent strain within the United States, we found a mutation, the D614G mutation that led potentially to the greater transmissibility in the South in this outbreak on pandemic that we saw on the graph earlier. Okay, there's so much complexity here that just relying on this big curve of let everybody get sick and then eventually we'll have herd immunity is a fallacy. So that's the current epidemiological perspective.
Yeah, and a couple other comments to that. One is we do have several strains we're watching, but so far they're, with the exception of the one that Sanjay just mentioned, that may actually make it spread a little bit faster and outcompete the others. As far as immunity and how a vaccine would handle it, it looks like so far, as best we can tell, all the strains react the same way. You can have genetic changes that don't change how vulnerable it is to antibodies or to vaccines that are targeting certain structures. So, it's pretty much, if you track it genetically through a month of transmission through 4 sequential hosts, you'll probably find about 2 genetic changes that occurred. So it is mutating rapidly, but the overwhelming majority of those mutations don't seem to have any effect on anything.
Right.
The other thing to keep in mind is that herd immunity is not a binary thing. You're either there or you're not. It's an incremental process. And Sanjay was talking 10, 12%. I've seen numbers that suggest New York City is probably in the low 20s, maybe 25% now. And you start getting up in 15, 20% numbers, and if herd immunity is at 60 or 70, you're actually getting a little bit of a tailwind from that.
Yes.
1 out of 5 times the virus tries to jump to the next target, it's someone who's already immune. So that means that New York probably has a little bit easier time than an identical city that had never, was totally naive to the virus and just getting it for the first time. So, it does over time, the little bits of herd immunity you're building up do help, and they, on top of mask wearing and contact tracing and social distancing, all help add up to finding a way to get RT down to 1.0.
Absolutely, absolutely correct. And so to round out the discussion, when we talk about effective herd immunity, and not just the acquired through the course of the pandemic, we are generally talking about a vaccinated population. We're talking about post-vaccination, where 60, 70, 80% of the population over time gets vaccinated. And that is the real epidemiological definition of herd immunity is that population for which a vaccine has been effective, delivered and provided some measure of protection. That population is creating immunity for those who cannot be vaccinated or who have not been vaccinated. And that's what Mike was just mentioning, that it becomes harder at 50% vaccination, it becomes much harder for the virus to be as effective in transmission than it was at 40%. Or at 70%, it's much, much harder than when only half of the population has been vaccinated. So there's this incremental build-on effect on when the exposure to the vaccination develops a protection for those who have not yet been vaccinated or not yet been exposed to.
Sanjay?
Yeah.
I remember there was some talk a couple months ago about immunity being based on how severe your illness was. So
yes, absolutely.
The sicker you got, the higher your immunity level. Asymptomatic people had a very low immunity level.
Yeah, some of the papers that that were pre-print, but they were indicating that it was seen that asymptomatic carriers, their shedding of virus and eventual non-detectability of the virus was a result of the first layer of immunity known as innate immunity. So there wasn't a B cell response. There wasn't a coordination of helper T cells and that second deeper layer of immunity that comes with, we call it innate versus acquired, right? So they're shedding and everything. That the reason they didn't get the full-on COVID symptomatology is because it remained as an upper respiratory subclinical infection. And subclinical means they didn't get any, real feeling of being sick. They were carrying the virus, but they just went about their lives, and maybe 10 to 12 to 14 days later, they actually shed a lot of virus to other people asymptomatically, but their immune system didn't have to go to that next level of antibody production to get rid of the virus. So they were exposed and they carried and they may have shed, but there's no evidence of long-term or at all exposure, okay? Versus those who had the infection, had upper respiratory symptoms for a short period of time, 4 days, 6 days, and then it descended into the lower respiratory tract and they got classical COVID symptoms, which is loss of taste, loss of smell, cough, and fever, intractable fever, difficulty breathing, pneumonia, etc. And in those patients, it was far more likely to find detectable antibodies. So that is correct. Okay. All right. Are we completely off our, where am I? Am I trying to, here, sharing. Okay, quit. This is what happens, Mike and Doug and others who've joined us for the first time. We never stick to the to the topic list. All right, so yeah, this is the beginning of talking about long COVID. So we've seen this slide before. This is the classical COVID cycle, and this comes in at perfect timing, what Terry mentioned. So mild infection over here is seen in 80% or more of cases. You may have the descent into the lower respiratory tract even in these cases, but the course of their infection is mild. It is an asymptomatic or mild infection, and it doesn't involve all of this stuff over here, okay? A severe, moderate to severe infection tends to involve the effector T cells, macrophages within the alveoli, the buildup of, what we talked about the last time we met, which was the bradykinin theory, the buildup of hyaluronic acid and a kind of thick gel within the alveoli that was causing both damage and ineffectiveness of the ventilators in some of these patients. And so, Madeline and others are friends here that have healthcare backgrounds, that have worked in ICUs, that know how ventilators are utilized, and we're also familiar with immune response. She indicated very early on that this is a mast cell issue. That the activation of mast cells and cytokines very early on was what was causing a massive amount of damage, and not just the viral infection. And in fact, the virus was stimulating all of these other issues that caused the amount of damage that we were seeing. And so that damage is a microvascular in origin. That means it's not just hanging out and interrupting normal processes and causing pathology in the lungs. It's also infecting endothelium of the microvasculature all over the body. So it's causing clotting. It's causing disseminated intravascular coagulation, microcoagulopathies that are damaging the heart muscle, that are damaging kidneys, that are damaging the lungs. We're seeing this in a majority of those patients that suffer from post-COVID syndrome. So this is the mess of cytokines that we've talked about in the past that get involved here. We've talked about how interferon, nebulized interferon given to certain patients at a particular time in their course of disease has in fact led to much better outcomes, about 80 to 90% better outcomes in a trial in the United Kingdom. And that's because the interruption of normal antiviral processes of the immune system, that disruption allowed the virus to spread more rapidly. So reintroducing artificial interferon into the lungs directly was sparing patients from the worst of the symptoms. Why am I talking about this? It's because that the treatment modalities that we've come up with, not only in the acute syndrome, patients getting acutely ill and being treated, but also we're learning that these are becoming effective. Am I sharing my screen? Guys? Yeah? Okay. Okay. All right. So one of the things that we've learned is that this is actually we're seeing that the treatment in the acute syndrome is also effective in the post-acute, and that gives us a lot of indication of where this pathology is originating. So low dose corticosteroids continues to calm the cytokine storm, the bradykinin storm, the sequestration of abnormal immune response is now being treated with corticosteroids such as methylprednisone, dexamethasone. And that continues at low doses after their acute syndrome. Antithrombotics, I don't know if Katie is with us tonight. I think she was going to maybe try to join us. She has been joining us. She's still in the hospital. But the anticoagulant, acute care anticoagulant, is to prevent those clots. Those clots were the killers in the initial 2 months of COVID in New York City. They were causing pulmonary embolism. They were causing strokes, massive strokes. They were causing renal embolisms, acute renal failure. So these tiny little clots would then dislodge they would form as a result of the derangement caused by infection. Microvascular derangement would then create thrombus. These clots would travel to various places in the body and wreak havoc and cause death. So by giving clot busters, this is one of the terms that we use, clot busters such as enoxaparin, and less effectively aspirin, longer term, the threat of clots going and causing blindness, retinopathy, stroke, anywhere a clot can go and stop blood flow and cause death or damage to tissue is precluded greatly by giving antithrombotics. This is, from week 3 or week 4, Terry and I have been talking about supplements. People were desperately looking for something they could go into GNC or Walmart and grab off the shelf, and and it was
oleander and hydroxychloroquine.
It was going to protect them. Does vitamin C protect me? Does vitamin D or whatever? We've told everyone, being nourished will protect you from any illness. Being well nourished is critical in a flu season. It's critical in a pandemic. It's critical when you're traveling to new places. Being well nourished means that having all the cofactors such as vitamins and minerals. And so zinc supplementation, vitamin D supplementation, vitamin C have shown benefit. And there's no magic bullet here. There's no secret. It just, these augment normal processes in a metabolically active immune system that requires nourishment. And instead of scrounging around for it, if you provide it to your body, it's there when it needs it. Okay? Long haulers. So what we're trying to do now, and what Dr. Marasco brought to my attention, is that long haulers are more likely women by 2 to 3, a margin of, 2/3 of all patients with long haul syndrome are women, 60% to 40% male. And this, within the population of women, the women who have the worst forms of post-COVID syndrome are those who had pre-existing autoimmune disease. So that means that they may not have gone through the worst course of disease as a result of COVID infection, but when they have that, when they are in the post-infectious phase, their recovery has been stymied by the fact that they have had a pre-existing autoimmune disease. So the derangement of an autoimmune disease caused by COVID has been resulting in women, especially, having a much more difficult and much more longer course of recovery. Okay, so that's one discovery that's been made. So in order to treat them, again, low dose corticosteroids, anti-inflammatories at low doses such as statins, aspirin. Again, melatonin is one of those off-the-shelf solutions. We don't recommend that it's used long-term. It is a naturally produced cell signaler, neurotransmitter, and it is part of the normal circadian rhythm. So melatonin is produced in the brain and ascending reticular activating system as a way at the end of the day to get rest, to sleep. So when you take additional melatonin, at the end of the day, especially, you will get a more restful sleep. That's it. It also has a very mild anti-inflammatory effect, and that's just being a natural neurotransmitter. Continue to take supplements because your body is in a state of metabolic demand as a result of recovering from damage, vasculature throughout the entire body. A lot of women that I've spoken to have said, I used to run before this. I could run 5 miles, no problem. Now I can barely get half a mile, but I've been getting a little bit better. Month by month, I've been able to recover back to my baseline. And it's because of this long-standing metabolic demand that is caused by the slow repair of a huge amount of microvasculature. Okay, and then to track all of it, cardiopulmonary imaging and liver function, blood markers, which I'll go into next, which is the critical biomarkers present in the treatment of an assessment, I should say, prognosis of COVID. All right, here we are. Now I'm going to pause again if we have any questions. Terry, any questions?
Yeah, I want to find it here because someone had asked why there isn't more being done to track through sewage to find blasting off hotspots. Now, and I've saw there has been some success with this.
Yes.
So I understand why the question popped up,
Yeah.
but it's been in very specific areas where they could track that way. In a wide, where you have a wide spread of people, it's a little bit harder to dial it into a specific area.
Yeah, it would be great. We've done 100 million tests now almost in this country, and we've done jack shit with the results. So, so adding a new assessment of the pandemic, another modality, I don't think it's great. I mean, some of the research that was done that initially showed that there was a fecal presence of the virus that precedes a outbreak. The fecal presence in the sewage of a community, precedes an outbreak. That was, rather brilliant finding. Whether we use it at all, I don't think we are currently doing that. But
we're really not even getting a one-day response back on tests.
So yeah, I mean, it does have the practical advantage that compared to getting your PCR test and the results back and recorded, that it might give you a 1 week earlier heads up that a spike is coming. Yes. But I think Sanjay nailed it. If we're going to not react to the data anyway, we don't really need that many new data sources.
Exactly. But yeah, so great. I mean, it's a good question because we saw that. I think we put up a graph of that early on. I think we saw that in June. There's a paper out of Indian Institute of Medical Science where they were doing that, and it is what I like to say about discoveries like that is, hey, maybe next pandemic we'll use that. So anyway, this is what it looks like, the critical biomarkers in the different phases, right? So what does it look like when the patient is just asymptomatic? Um, we're not even testing. The CDC recommendations have changed on whether we should even test asymptomatics. My recommendation has been from the very beginning, even if you are suspected of coming across someone with COVID, even if you've traveled and come back home from a suspected high, prevalence area, get tested. Even if you feel totally fine, get the test. If there's ever a suspicion, it is also, it's a safety factor for your family and for your community to know whether you're positive from some activity that may have exposed you. So the normal tests in an ideal circumstance for asymptomatic patients would be to know. And then in mild to moderate patients, there are the normal blood tests, right? So your white count, your red count, and all the other assays that come with your complete blood count and chemistry. There will be some derangement in many patients of the serum ferritin, as well as the clotting time. And that is a result of the, again, okay, so if you have clotting factors in your blood and they're being increasingly used, then their bleeding time is going to get longer. Your byproducts of clotting are going to start to appear in your blood. And one of the most important byproducts of clotting is something called D-dimer. And that assay has been shown to be highly prognostic as to the severity of the disease. So a D-dimer of greater than 2 milligrams per liter, it has been shown to correlate with a very poor prognosis in patients. And we've seen D-dimers as high as 8, 10, 12 in the course of some of these patients with very severe, disseminated microcoagulopathy as a result of COVID. The other things that to look for are later on as the severity increases, or if the patient appears to presents to hospital with a severe form of COVID, then some of the things that we need to test for immediately. And I'll show you a workup chart that I want everybody to have, but things that we test for to tell how bad their body is metabolically being challenged is their liver enzymes. So transaminases, we call them ALT, AST and ALT, your triglycerides, as well as interleukin-6, C-reactive protein, which is an indicator of inflammation, and any reduction in the platelet count. So the platelet count in D-dimer is basically telling us, the clinicians, there's clotting, lots of clotting, and we need to start treating that because, like I said, if we let it go, then, well, let me back up. If we don't do these things, and a lot of doctors were not doing these things in March and April, the patient can lead to, this can lead the patient to all the things we just discussed: stroke, heart attack, cardiac damage, disseminated tissue damage. Now that we know that this is happening, this should be a standard part of the workup of every patient. The reason I want you to know this, and I want you to take the next slide with you if you ever get sick, which I pray you will not ever get sick, but take it with you, is because not every doctor in every community hospital in the country knows this yet. Don't be surprised. They don't. So these are the standard orders that should be done, okay? The D-dimer, the C-reactive protein, the platelets, and what they mean, what eventually the results mean need to be well known. So this is why I'm trying to get this information out there. Critical patients will have other cytopenias. Cytopenia just means a reduction in the count of certain, it could be your RBC count, it could be your platelet count, it could be your specific type of white blood cell that are being, rapidly destroyed as a result of the response in the lungs or wherever else. And increase in renal function markers that indicate renal failure. Okay, so that only occurs really in very, very severe patients in intensive care. So what do we want doctors to be ordering? That's a bit technical, so this is what I would teach medical students or like first-year residents or something. But this is more like print this out and take it with you. Madeline has been writing stuff down and tucking it inside of the case of her iPhone from our town halls, right, Terry? So I'm happy to be providing that. So, this is from Brigham and Women's, a synthesis of all the recommendations from Mayo, University of California, San Francisco, Hopkins, and just the other leading academic medical centers, as they have Mount Sinai, as they've created what we call order sets, which is the one button thing for doctors to click if they suspect and confirm COVID. It's one button, and the electronic medical record sends these orders to the lab. Okay, so based on the order sets that are being utilized and created across all of these major institutions, this is what Brigham came up with. This is my bread and butter. This is what I do for a living, evidence-based medicine in a medical informatics environment, and how to push this out to doctors. So it comes down to the easy button. Okay, the easy button to do it right the first time. I build easy buttons. So this is it. They need to have their complete blood count, magnesium, LFTs, troponin, all of this stuff, D-dimer. And all of this will tell them about the status of the infection and how bad it is. How's it going in the fight inside of your body? And then,
is this going to be posted on your page,
yes,
in the
absolutely.
MD page? Okay,
Absolutely.
Someone was asking on Facebook. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the link to get the full thing that you can print out at home for yourself. Okay, but this will definitely get posted as soon as the town hall's over. All right, so and this is something that they should adhere to. Adhering to it is one thing, interpreting it is the second. Okay, so interpreting it is probably where you'd want this printed out and handed to the staff. And if you guys have any questions here, go and learn, because what I saw happen to Katie this weekend just is heartbreaking and extremely, extremely frustrating to me. When it's your industry, your community that is failing like this, failing so badly, it's embarrassing, and I feel ashamed. So this is a standard of care that we must be doing. This is the things that the CDC should be issuing out to every community hospital. JACO, OSHA, NIH should be having a weekly briefing, a weekly 3-hour briefing to update every director of quality and safety of every hospital in the country, to update them on these protocols. And instead, I'm doing it, but that's okay. It's all right. You don't want me, Terry knows, you don't want me in, you don't want Dr. Fauci to retire and then they call Sanjay, because then the first news conference will be, you dumb mother. It won't be a calm, rational Dr. Fauci couching all of it and selecting words carefully not to offend anyone, or no, I will be livid. So radiologically, very, very simple. If they're not doing a chest X-ray, then, I mean, that is just the absolute basic. You have to get a chest X-ray as soon as you are, if you come into the ER with high fever, breathlessness, and all the other symptoms of COVID. ideally a chest CT. So throughout Europe, they have standardized the chest CT as a diagnostic tool to find the pathognomic indicators of COVID. And this is, I don't know why they're telling us in this country that the CT is not absolutely necessary. I mean, if you're going to diagnose it on chest CT, on chest X-ray, and you're good to go. But especially in post-COVID syndrome, there may be damage to the lung architecture that is the causative, reason behind the breathlessness and lack of recovery and other issues. If the patient has a oxygen saturation of lower than 94 on room air, there has to be some pathology at work, okay? Obstructive pathology or infective pathology. And obstructive, we know chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and all this other stuff that causes low saturation. But I'm talking about in an infectious state, it's probably because the lung's filling up with fluid. If it's not filling up with fluid, then there's some other form of problem that's precluding the normal transfer, what we call oxygenation. So the ways to discover that most accurately is with a chest CT. Okay. Abdominal issues, especially damage to the liver, kidneys, etc., can be discovered on ultrasound without having to put the patient in through, to do an MRI or anything else that's too expensive or, demanding. When you have a lot of patients that need it, the quick diagnostic effort is the best one. Okay. Any questions?
We're clear on questions, Sanjay.
Okay, great. So again, this we'll publish. All right. So lastly, this is going back to the week 2, week 3.
Yeah.
I continue to see people saying that, masks don't work, they're useless. I heard one woman complain on the page of a surgical technician friend of mine who has been advocating, please, everyone, just please wear a mask. This is here in Pennsylvania where we're doing well. Everyone here that is proud of how we're doing here has been saying, keep up the good work, keep wearing the masks. And then others are like, when is this gonna be over? Masks suck, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, yeah, they suck. But the minute you take them off, 2 weeks later, we're gonna get an outbreak. Okay, that's the reality. Okay, what Mike just described as suppression is a long-term strategy. Nowhere along that suppression line do we take off our masks. We don't take off our masks even when the day the vaccine arrives. We don't take off our masks until at least 60% of the population has been vaccinated. I want people to understand that. I mean, Mike, am I wrong?
I mean, it's a trade-off. We could skip the masks entirely and just close all the schools, all the bars, and all the restaurants and call it a wash.
There. Okay. So exactly. So which one do you want? Right? Exactly. He said it better than I could have. All right. So that's what it comes down to. Masks are here to stay. And there are going to be a lot of people that say, oh, they get dirty and there's going to be bacteria and you just get sick from whatever collects in the mask. And Karen had a brilliant suggestion, I guess last week or the week, the last time we met, which was consider your mask like your underwear. Don't put on dirty underwear in the morning. Don't keep dirty underwear in your car. Don't keep dirty underwear in your pocket. Replace underwear with mask.
And don't wear somebody else's.
Yeah, and don't wear somebody else's dirty underwear. You forget about clean. So yes, they're here to stay. They are necessary. Get used to them and get used to the hygiene associated with appropriate and effective mask wearing. So, my boys are back in school. They are 10 and 12, and bless them, they have, mask requirement. They're in school from morning till 3 o'clock, 3:30 when I pick them up, and all their class time requires a mask. And they're distanced in the hallways. And, I tip my hat to their school. I tip my hat to their principal and teachers. And this is now their third week of doing so. Inevitably, what's going to happen with 10 and 12-year-old boys? Go out to the car in the morning, pull out of the driveway. Dad, I forgot my mask, right? So we've had to turn around, go get back. But now I'm like, no way. I bought packs of disposable masks because the cloth ones, I don't feel are going to be long-term, very, very, we just don't have the discipline of washing it every other day, or having what do you call it, a cycle of having 7 of them and then washing them cyclically so that there's always a clean one and all that stuff. So yes, it's wasteful and it's environmentally detrimental that 300 million people are going to be using masks for the next 9 months, disposable ones. Yeah, it's horrible. But have both strategies. Have a mask strategy where you have cloth, comfortable masks that you wash and that you put on only when it's clean. Okay. And then also have your backup, which is if you forget your mask, wherever, there's a spare disposable somewhere, especially with kids. Okay, in your car, and somewhere clean, a glove box or whatever, that's isolated from the rest of anything that could contaminate it. All right. Mask usage, we talked about. Don't hang it from your rearview mirror and all that other stuff. And the touching. Now I keep hearing the complaint is, well, you touch it and it gets dirty and blah, blah, blah. And so don't touch it. When you're putting it on and taking it off, use the straps. But please, I'm trying to get everybody to understand, Mike just said it better than I can. You either use the mask, and we do our utmost to suppress this until not just the vaccine is available, but well beyond the date of its availability to the date where we have a large segment of our society vaccinated and we feel safer. And our infection rates are extremely low. Okay. Then, in your community, if you haven't had an infection in 40 days, you can be a little bit more relaxed about a mask. But if you had 3 yesterday, you better put that mask on. I don't care if it's, I should say, even if you only have 3 infections in your county, like we had reported yesterday, you better keep that mask on. Because the minute you, go lax on these things, like Mike described at the bottom of that curve, it'll start kicking itself up.
And ironically, it actually ties back into the earlier conversation about sewage, that if we do get to the level that the infection rate is very low, having a lot of people tested frequently isn't as practical. And that's where monitoring sewage could be a very, very good early alarm that we don't know who it is, but it's spreading again, put the masks on.
Exactly. Now, say if you're doing 100,000 tests and you're only detecting, what Mike's scenario, you're doing 100,000 tests and you're only detecting 1,200 nationally, then there has to be some other more sensitive indicator of where the threat is, or where there might be a potential outbreak in 6 to 8 days or whatever. So, right. And Mike, can you describe how it's less effort to do suppression once you've reached a level than it is to do the other things?
Yeah, because it's actually comparing keeping a very low level of suppression versus a fairly high level with mitigation in your hospitals doing a really bang up business. If you take the same level of NPIs, they're both going to yield an RT of about 1.0. If you have your bars and restaurants at 25% capacity, and your schools open in person, and whatever other mask mandate, whatever, it takes essentially the same effort to keep that flat line, whether you're at a high level or a low level. But at a low level, something else happens, and that is contact tracing is much, much more effective when they can do a very, very thorough job. If you have one contact tracer for every 10 new cases a day, they might as well just go on vacation. They're not going to make a difference.
Right.
If you have 10 contact tracers for one new case a day, they can cover everything and follow up and really make a difference, so that maybe the other NPIs that are much more onerous don't have to be as strict. So you can actually keep a low level with a slightly lower level of effort than keeping a high level, which just seems, it's like the equivalent of if you got better gas mileage driving at 100 miles an hour than at 20. It's like, it seems like it shouldn't be true, but it actually works out that way.
It is. You're right. It's absolutely. It's that efficiency. Once you've achieved the goal, the efficiency becomes much greater of the effort. I believe that.
I want to share a question, Sanjay.
Yeah.
It came in on Facebook from Taz Ironworker.
Okay.
Yeah. How can anything less than an N99 protect from a particle that small? N95 allows particles of 2.5 ppm to pass through, and others do far less.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely true. But see, the virus is not airborne. Okay. There's a difference between airborne and droplet-based, which is aerosolized. Okay, so this is very important to understand that an airborne infectious agent can hang out in the air, okay, either on a dust particle or independently, and we've seen that with tuberculosis and measles, where the air itself is contaminated with the infectious agent. So in that environment, the infectious agent, again, can land on your conjunctiva of your eye. It can land inside of the nasal passage. And even with adequate high efficiency filtration, a very, very small virus, a very highly infectious virus as well, could find a way, through the protective equipment to become a viable infection. In this case, and in coronavirus in general, but specifically in COVID, the mode of infection is droplets. So the droplet size is crucially important here. The droplet size of 3 to 5 micrometers is what generally contains enough virus to cause a transmission. Okay, so what is a 3 to 5 micrometer droplet like? It is what you can't actually see coming out of your mouth and nose when you speak to another person or when you sneeze, but you might actually be able to understand that it is coming out of your face, out of your nose and mouth when you're outside on a cold day. When you're outside on a cold day, you can see the kind of water vapor, the condensate that comes out of your nose and mouth. Just imagine that that's there all the time, but invisible. Now, on those tiny little droplets, or in those tiny little droplets, is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? So when give me a second. Excuse me. So I don't necessarily need a N95 or an N99 mask to prevent that level of droplet from either falling on my nose and mouth or entering my nose and mouth when I'm using a surgical mask like this or a cloth mask, okay? And I am not 100% protected with this. No one is saying that this is providing 100% effectiveness. What it is it is precluding, if Terry and I were having a conversation and Terry is carrying it and doesn't know, if we are both wearing a mask, the amount of droplets that he is able to share with me in that conversation is far, far, far less. And I can't put a percentage on it, but is far, far, far less than if we were doing this.
Now, Watch
Okay?
this.
Yeah. Okay.
So now I'm going to speak to you like
Exactly.
any day, and this is what you're getting in your face.
Right.
That's my vape.
Yeah.
But if I don't exhale and I just talk while I'm doing it, it is blasting out of my face.
Right. Okay. Now, if you had a mask on, okay,
I can get a mask.
yeah, you should do a vape and put it on. Let's do this little experiment. Look at Mike. and there will be a significant reduction in what comes out, especially what comes out directly this way onto another person's nose and mouth and face. Okay. So now, if we distance ourselves more than the conversational distance of 3 feet or 2 feet to 6 feet and beyond with a mask on, okay, then the amount of droplets that we're sharing with each other is again further minimized, right? And that is the point of wearing a mask.
Okay, so now,
we don't.
if I'm talking and you see
Yeah.
a reduction in the actual vapor coming out of my mouth,
Yep.
I mean, you see there's a drastic difference.
Yep.
It looks like your mask is on fire.
Yeah. So that's what it comes down to. That's the basics of it. We're not saying that you can't get an infection if you're wearing a cloth mask or if you're wearing a surgical mask. It'll definitely protect you. No, definitely not. That's not the purpose. The purpose is a significant reduction in the amount of vapor droplets that are being circulated in the air. Now, imagine Terry, me, and 100 other people go into a grocery store together. It's in the air.
Yeah.
At that point, it's in the air, okay? And so if we're not wearing a mask, if we're wearing a mask, it's still in the air. But the probability of it landing in your nose and mouth is greatly reduced. And that's the point of masking, okay? And now the muddling of the message here is that, oh, masks aren't effective if they aren't 99 or 95% effective. That's not the argument. The argument should be, look at the comparative effectiveness of what we do here in the United States versus what has been done in South Korea, where there's 99.9% mask usage. What is their rate of transmission versus our highly variable rate of mask usage? That's the comparative effectiveness that we should be looking at, not an N95 versus a surgical mask or an N99 versus a homemade cloth mask.
And
That's not the
Janine
comparative effectiveness question.
Yeah, so Janine Baker asked on Facebook that she heard that a mask only protects others and not the person wearing it. Is that true? Well, yes, but if everyone's wearing a mask, you're protecting each other.
Yeah.
It's not a hard concept.
Yeah.
And it also does do some protection for the wearer.
Exactly.
Yeah, some, but what I'm saying is if you saw me vape and you're walking by someone who's exhaling that, it's going to give you protection, but that person is also keeping his breath to himself.
Yeah. It is a comparative, please, let's think about it comparatively, okay? It's not a single virus trying to get from Terry to me. It's at least 10,000 viral particles that have to land inside of me from him. That is made easier by us being as close as possible. That is made easier by us not wearing masks. That is made easier by...
I'm having trouble hearing you.
That was Siri. One of my digital assistants has to chime in every single time, right? It's got to be Google or Siri. Anyway, so whatever is made easiest for the virus is something we need to make hard for it, okay? So distance, masking, duration. This is why we tell people, don't go into the grocery store and just hang around shopping and reading the labels. Read the labels at home, make a list, go in there like you're a JSOC operative, go kill and leave. Okay, get your groceries and get out of there, because there's hundreds of other people doing the exact same thing. And the longer they stay in that environment, the higher the percentage of, the chance of getting infected. So minimize your duration in a highly public environment. Make sure that you're as far away from people that you don't know, okay, as you can be, and make sure that you're wearing a mask during that entire process. And then all of a sudden, we're South Koreans. Okay. All right. Do we have more? More questions? Okay. Let's see what I got.
I did get a follow-up from Taz.
Okay.
What about reduced blood oxygen? I have personally seen a pulse ox reading of 82% on me with the surgical mask walking upstairs.
Yeah, well then, Taz, you probably want to go get checked out because that generally doesn't happen. I mean, we've had physicians and nurses put 5-6 masks on and do their pulse ox, and it's still between 98 and 100. Okay, so a surgical mask or a cloth mask should not be reducing oxygenation because of the percentage of the percentage mix of gases in normal air, and the way that your bloodstream works. It is very normal for the carbon dioxide oxygen exchange to happen even when you're wearing 2, 3, or 4 masks, and even when healthcare workers wear things called paper masks, which are high efficiency rebreathers. So the rebreather is actually something that prevents a fresh air circulation in a highly contaminated environment. Even in rebreather masks, the oxygenation is well above 90% normal.
Okay, Taz did follow up with he does have a 9/11 related COPD illness.
COPD will do it, Taz. Yeah.
But still, a mask shouldn't affect that to the degree or...
No, not at all. COPD can, definitely. I was talking about obstructive lung disease causing low oxygenation earlier. Obstructive lung disease, definitely. That's why you should minimize the mask usage, but it's only because it will make you uncomfortable. It's not going to do anything for the oxygenation. Okay. Let me get through this. I think so. I think we're solid there. This is my angry Sanjay. Things that make you that are more uncomfortable than wearing a mask is gasping for air, coughing up blood, permanent lung damage, being on a ventilator and all this other stuff. We have documented evidence that countries that have pervasive mask usage have the lowest rates of transmission and therefore have been the fastest to recover from the initial effects of the pandemic. Okay. And then any questions on vaccines? I've covered this many times, but I think that we should probably take a moment and talk about the 2 top candidates again. The Moderna vaccine is based on a novel platform. The only thing that's in the vial is mRNA, okay? It's a nucleic acid. It is the sequences taken directly from the SARS-CoV-2 highly conserved regions of the virus. Highly conserved means that they're the same no matter what strain you get them from. They're as highly conserved. They're almost the same as, so strain A through G, the part of the spike protein or the part of the envelope protein that is the exact same across all the strains. They've tried to find that, and then they go backwards from it to the nucleic acid sequence that specifies that. Then they purify it, amplify it, and then they create the vaccine from it. The point of it is once it enters your muscle, it's injected into your muscle, the satellite cells of the muscle, which are kind of adult stem cell, will take them up and produce the protein. It'll enter the bloodstream, and then the immune system will recognize them as non-self, and it will create an immune response. So that immune response of antibodies and then eventually sequestering the T cells and immune memory is a form of vaccination. Okay, so the only issue, and we've discussed this many times with the Moderna approach, is that it is the first time that this platform has been used to treat a viral pandemic as a vaccine. The AstraZeneca approach is an approach that's been used many times before, which is live attenuate. It's a combination of an attenuated live virus and a recombinant technique. So basically what that means is we take bits of the SARS virus, okay, SARS-CoV-2, the COVID virus, and we re-engineer it, or we recombine it into a existing virus. The virus that AstraZeneca is using is, and I hesitate to say this because people will get, weirded out. It's a chimpanzee adenovirus. So it's the adenovirus that doesn't normally infect human beings because it's specific to the chimpanzee. There's many reasons why we're doing that, but the easiest way to explain it is it doesn't cause sickness in us. Okay, that's why we're using it. We're using it as a platform because it doesn't cause sickness in us, but it infects in a way that's very similar to COVID. Okay, it's an upper respiratory, lower respiratory infection, and that infection process is going to simulate the process of being infected by the COVID virus. And what happens with that is the immune response then kicks in. Hi, Leslie. The immune response just kicks in, and then we get as if you were exposed to COVID. So it is, what I call it is a sheep in wolf's clothing approach. All right. So you try to make the body think that it's been infected by COVID when in fact it's just been infected by this engineered simulation of that. Okay. So the reason there is a very strong push with the AstraZeneca is because it's being backed by the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK. It has it was first out to clinical trials, so it went past phase 2 quickly and into phase 3, and showed safety and efficacy. There was now news that they have paused this development. So there was some adverse event in I think 1 or 2 patients, and they're trying to examine exactly what happened and whether it was in fact related to the vaccination. We are going to see hiccups like this along the way. This is why Mike and other who are saying, March 1, extremely aggressive. That's extremely aggressive. It is realistic in terms of if we started in March and, with this effort, and then March is 1 year from the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, in the world. So this is the fastest we've ever been able to produce a vaccine, but the March 1 to March 1 timeline is, I think, the reason Mike might be saying that would be the first batch that might be able to come out. But realistically, it would be mid to late summer when there's general availability of any particular platform. And so we're going to probably see hiccups with the Moderna approach as well. Our hope is that these companies, and they promise to be 100% transparent with us and provide all the data in their trials. So it's just a wait and watch now. There is obviously the political environment that we're living in, wherein the administration is pushing for a vaccine to be generally available, if not to everyone, but somehow available before the end of October and the election. And then I don't really see the point in doing that because general availability is going to take additional months. Deployment is going to take months. And whether it is this rapid to market, first ever platform of mRNA, or whether it is a more well-known and previously deployed platform like the AstraZeneca. And then you have others, Sanofi and Johnson & Johnson and many others are in the race. Any questions here?
Yeah, there was one that popped up on chat from 2019 iPad.
Okay, that's Madeline. That's
Yeah, I
not
know.
Madeline.
I know. I just wanted to call her that. Doctors noted that not many COVID patients were glass wearers. From a population in which 30% are mask wearers, only 6% of their COVID patients wore glasses. Possibly COVID is transmitted via the eyes more than thought before.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to find evidence for that. As far as recommendations, I've heard strong recommendations from a lot of physicians that have said if you're going to be on a flight, wear goggles. Especially if you are going to be on a flight and you are in a high risk category, you're age 65 or above, etc., wear safety goggles. Okay, and that makes sense. Now, I've also heard that modern aircrafts, cycle their internal fuselage air completely every 4 hours. So there is a complete, burn through of the air in the fuselage. It flows enough that you're not rebreathing the air of others throughout the flight. Even then, I would still recommend that, since we don't know, if you can find a comfortable pair of goggles, that would be an additional precaution that would be sensible to make if you're in that close of a setting for a long period of time. But I wouldn't go grocery shopping with them. I mean, as you would find an anecdote that glass wearers don't get it as easily. I would also be able to provide the anecdote that I've been shopping for 6 months in the same grocery store without glasses, and you know what I mean? It's like we don't have really solid evidence that the ocular route is a significant route of transmission, even with the droplet infection, even though we do have many cases where healthcare workers have been masked appropriately, wearing PPE, but without goggles, in close proximity in ICU settings with high viral load in the air, and they have contracted the infection. And the only reasonable way that they could have done that is through the eyes. So that's why we make the recommendation on a flight.
Plus, it came from China, and they're a bunch of lying bastards.
They are, I'll tell you what.
There's that. I mean,
so Taz will be happy to hear I'm all for sanctioning China on this. Taz is our I call him my pet cobra. He's a highly conservative commenter on my page. We've been I can't call it friends. we've been frenemies for many years, I guess. But I'm glad to see him join us and ask questions. That's awesome.
I recognize the name right away.
Yeah.
I did hear an interesting thing, when it comes to the failure of these vaccines will be the amount of people who don't actually get it. And the news one was from a doctor in Canada who wrote this thing that if you get the RNA vaccine, you'll no longer be considered human. I don't know if it's whoever wrote that confused RNA and DNA, but you wouldn't be considered human anymore. You'd be considered a subspecies of,
But so
it was about 2 pages long. I didn't get past 2 paragraphs and I moved on.
I have heard some just amazing stuff, amazing pseudoscience. Like I've heard that 80% of our genome is because of viruses, and I've heard because they take a little bit of knowledge, like a little nugget of knowledge, right? And they extrapolate it out to crazy. So yes, there is very strong evidence that the human species has been living with and incorporating viral DNA and bacterial DNA and other pieces of genomes of other species for more than 150 to 250,000 years of our species' existence to before the Homo sapiens as an entity. and primates. And so backing this all up to what we know of the human genome and how it interacts with viruses. And there's still a huge amount to learn, right? There's a huge amount to learn about how it has how infections have influenced our evolution, what protections they may have brought to us, actually as a result of being exposed to them, and all of this other stuff about our microbiome, right? So these are all aspects of infectious disease that are fascinating, and there's two schools of thought to this. I saw a cartoon of a dragon sitting on top of a pile of gold, and a guy came up and asked, what is this? And he said, "Shoo, idiot," right? And instead of sharing the treasure of knowledge with someone who really wants to know, we have a tendency to hoard that treasure for ourselves, either intellectually or otherwise, because we've gone through the rigor of acquiring it for ourselves through degrees and years of study and things like that. And so somebody comes up to us and asks us a question. Some of us try to make them feel foolish for even asking it. I'm guilty of it sometimes, but most of the time I welcome questions. I welcome people to ask anything and not feel ashamed of doing so, no matter how simple the question might be, because I'd rather you know something than think you know something. Thinking you know something is the most dangerous thing, okay? Because then it can cause harm. And we've seen too much of this with COVID, way too much. And that's the reason we have been doing this as a dedicated effort before every week for 6 months, and now we're going to be doing it monthly.
I got to confess, I'm still calling people wackadoodles.
I know.
I can't shake it. There's some people you find and they're goddamn wackadoodles.
I know. It's hard after a while of like I call them the HCQ wars. So Terry and I are veterans of the HCQ wars. During that, like, our page was just a daily repeat of the same nonsense over and over again. After the 20-second time of debunking something, you just get tired of it. You feel like, okay, let them believe whatever they want to believe, but that's not good either. That's not good. That's why we continue to talk about masks and distance and, aerosolized versus airborne. And because 8 months into this and people still are walking around with mythology in their heads. And it's the reason the performance in terms of our response to pandemic as a society is the worst in the world.
Well, Taz just followed up with, he was agreeing with everything up until the vaccine thing. You will not be genetically modified. If you've ever had a vaccine in your life, if you ever had a vaccine in your life, it's too late. You're genetically modified.
Or an infection.
Yeah, you're now you're a toaster, Taz. I'm sorry.
Look at Lorene. Oh, all the pets are out tonight. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of another lovely evening together. And I will have to be more strict about this because I do have to make sure that my boys are in bed and all that other good stuff. Are there any last questions?
Are we cutting Facebook off, or are we doing the whole thing at once?
Oh, yes, we are. I think we'll end for now because I have two announcements. After the questions, I have two announcements, and then we're going to end.
Okay.
Any questions? Any follow-ups?
Yeah, anyone want to jump on with a quick question? Go ahead.
Is Doug still with us?
No, Doug left, and Taz said HCQ works, LOL. So does Oleander.
Exactly. Okay. All right. So here are the. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to know, is there a new update for medication interactions?
Unfortunately, I have not seen, especially in the antiviral sector. So remdesivir was the last candidate, used candidate out of that category. Remember, we talked about a lot
Right.
of antivirals that were in the pipeline. I still haven't seen tocilizumab and all of these other monoclonals that were very good, leronlimab, that were very good initial candidates. I don't know where they are in the pipeline right now. We heard a lot about them in the first 3 months. I anticipate that we will hear a lot about them in the beginning of next year as their commercial trials begin to show data. So those were academic trials. They went to commercial trials, and we'll see how they do. But right now, remdesivir is the sole antiviral that's being generally used. And of the immunomodulators, the update is obviously on aviptidil and on interferon beta being the primary useful ones. Immunomodulators, along with dexamethasone, methylprednisolone, and then the anticoagulants. So our good old, right?
Okay. So they haven't started with the meds that decrease bradykinins and.
No, haven't seen a single paper yet. So although that we provided that list from last week,
right.
I will show it to you again. That list of the candidates. I haven't seen anything yet, but I will keep my eye out because Madeline is my molecular biology whisperer. So he keeps me on my toes.
And I do have one more question from Facebook when you're all done.
Okay. Here we go. So these are the candidates for treatment of the bradykinin aspect of the storm. So, I would like to see some trialing of this in the long haulers, because I think that, as you mentioned, mast cells and bradykinin are involved in long COVID. I believe that they are involved in, and Dr. Marasco in Italy believes they're involved in long COVID as well. So again, I'll post this to our page so you can download it.
So I shouldn't tape it to the back of my phone yet.
You can do that too, yeah.
I seriously have toxilizum.
Yeah.
Leronlimab, low molecular weight heparin, and convalescent plasma, vitamin C and D. Should I just leave that?
Leave it there for now. The most important thing is to have my cell number on the back of your phone. That's all you need. That's all.
Okay, cool.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. Janine Baker on Facebook asked, what are the chances of someone with PPH recovering from this? Does a person with no spleen put them at a higher risk?
That's a very good question. In fact, it's a very good question, because let me not answer that without further reference, okay? Because the kind of immunological derangement that's causing long COVID doesn't have to do with that kind of functional architecture loss. Okay, so not having a spleen or having some longer term disorder. The ones that we're talking about have to do with like lupus and even type 1 diabetes has a much worse course of COVID than type 2. So we have these weird things that are going on at the subcellular molecular level with immunological derangement, but not at the functional architectural level. So, but I will write that down as something to look into, and then maybe ask. Remind me next month, and then I'll definitely cover it. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're caught up on questions.
Thank you, Terry. Okay, so the announcements. Here's the exciting thing. Usually we used to have a post show, and we'll try to do that next month. Still organizing around, having the boys go to school and having to take them into school in the morning. We have no buses running because of COVID, which is good. That's fine. Terry and I are embarking on a new adventure together. Okay, and we are starting a weekly podcast, and it is a more the audience we hope is going to be very broad. The topics we cover are going to be very broad, but it's basically the news of the week, and not generally focused only on the contentiousness of politics, but having a long view of what is going on a weekly basis with an eye towards societal change. So where are we headed, and what can we do today to ensure that 3, 5, 10 years from now, things are different around the issues that we're facing today, whether that's healthcare or whether that's bigotry and discrimination, whether it's drug abuse and addiction and recovery, things that we have personal experience with or that we come across in the news. Terry has a habit of going down rabbit holes and finding and pulling out, like, just going down deep into a topic, and then he loves to bring that forward and talk about that. And I'll be his sidekick when he does that. And then he'll be my sidekick when I talk about healthcare reform and cost and the decoupling of value from healthcare and delivery, and what we pay with our insurance premiums and what we actually get, and all of that stuff. So we are calling it we're basing it on a running joke that we have between each other called Munt Udoshi Industries. Okay, so Munt Udoshi Industries is an imaginary entity that we created, mostly Terry. It's a brainchild of Terry's. It is the most nefarious company in the world. Okay, everything it does is nefarious. We only use either child or refugee labor in failed states for the production of our products. We only operate in countries that have autocrats or no form of regulation with officials that we can bribe to get our way. And using this as an analogy for a world just gone absolutely anarcho-capitalist nuts. All right, that's the overarching theme for the podcast. But the true value of it and in the conversations that we'll be having is how to have a world where Munt Udoshi Industries shouldn't exist.
But I do have a goggles contract through Brazil, and we should have more on that on our next show.
They're making them in the favelas, right, in Rio?
Exactly.
Okay. All right. I love you all, and we'll upload the PowerPoint so you can all have that. We will be announcing the podcast availability probably this Sunday. We'll be doing our first recording, and then it'll be out on different platforms and things like that. Welcome to send us ideas, contributions in terms of topics and things like that. We did our first 2 production meetings with a brainstorming of topics. Anything you guys want to contribute to the effort would be much appreciated. Okay.
We have an email, and we'll give that out next time. It's
yes.
We'll have it all for you.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
We'll do our post show next time.
Say bear.
Good night, everyone.